Hi, and welcome back to the channel Biblical Mysteries. My name is Dr. Rich Sorensen, and I'm your host for this channel. And this video is a continuation of episode number 1 of the video series, Were the Nephilim Genetically Psychopathic? So you should watch that first if you haven't seen it yet. Now, as was previously mentioned, I'll be referring to many resources that you may want to check out for yourself. This video is based on a paper I've written, which footnotes all of those references, so there are links to the paper in the description box. Now, the last episode ended with considering the reappearance of Nephilim-like individuals in the land of Canaan. There are a significant number of Old Testament references to tall and belligerent men that seem to have Nephilim genetics in their bloodline. These include Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. And of him it was written, "For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. It is in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. Its length was 9 cubits, and its width 4 cubits by the ordinary cubit." And that's from Deuteronomy chapter 3. Now, Og was of the Rephaim, meaning of the dead ones. In other words, the dead Nephilim. Translating from cubits meant that his bed was around 14 feet long by about 6 feet wide. And there were other Nephilim-related groups in Canaan, such as the Anakim, and as well as Goliath of Gath and his brothers, that David later fought. Now, Bashan was the area over which Og ruled, and included the Mount Hermon region, where the arrival of the sons of God was said to have occurred, as we will discuss below. Writings from the large cache of cuneiform tablets that were discovered at the ancient Syrian city of Ugarit indicate that Bashan cities of Ashtoreth and Edrei were considered to be gateways to the underworld. And the texts from Ugarit tell tales of the sexual conquests of the god Baal, and also reveal that the Canaanite tribes were probably the most sexually debauched of all ancient peoples. Sacred prostitution may have been invented there, along with other evil practices such as burning babies as an act of worship and sacrifice. Now, Ashtoreth was the main city of Bashan, and it was named after Ashtoreth, a Canaanite goddess of fertility, love, war, and the crescent moon. She represented the passive principle in nature. And she was said to be the daughter of the god El and the Phoenician goddess Asherah. And she was the wife of the god Baal, or so it was said, and like Semiramis from Sumer, she was known as the Queen of Heaven. Ancient gods and goddesses tended to morph into each other from one society to the next, and their characteristics were typically fluid. So Ashtoreth was a Canaanite version of Astarte from Syria, Ishtar from Babylon, Isis from Egypt, and all of these later morphed into Aphrodite in Greece and Venus in Rome. Now, there may very well have been other gods and goddesses in Canaan, but the Baals and the Ashtoreths may have been used as a generic term for all of the pagan gods and goddesses in their various forms. Now, the word Ashtaroth meant womb or young, hence the association with sex, fertility, and the worship of the moon. And that, in turn, was associated with bulls and cows. Sex in that agricultural time was typically linked to the growth of animals and crops, and prostitution as a form of worship was carried out by the Canaanite people in groves that contained Asherah poles. Possibly they were a phallic symbol. The name Ashtoreth is unique to the Bible and seems to be a combination of the goddess Astarte with the Hebrew word for shame, which is Boshet. Now, in addition to being the wife of Baal, Ashtoreth was also associated with the Canaanite god Molech and Chemosh from Edom. And these were fierce gods who sometimes demanded the sacrifice of infants. Babies were placed in the arms of Molech's brass statue and burned to death. Ugaritic texts present Molech as an ancient god of the underworld, involved in the cult of Rephaim, the dead Nephilim ancestors, and the worship of snakes. Now, people tend to become like the gods they revere and worship, and the results in Canaan were a societal harshness and selfishness, an uncaring spirit, cruelty toward women and children, and hostility towards strangers. Therefore, at least some of the Canaanite tribes had both the physical, psychological, and spiritual characteristics that were seemingly inherited from the Nephilim. And all of these tribes were the descendants of Canaan. And he was a grandson of Noah, and he was cursed by his grandfather for engaging in some form of perverted sexual activity. This is described in the strange story from the book of Genesis. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine, became drunk, and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both of their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away, so they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." And that's from Genesis chapter 9. Now, uncovering the nakedness of one's father is a biblical euphemism for incest, either a homosexual act done on Noah or a heterosexual act done on Noah's wife. The text states that Noah knew what his youngest son had done to him, which indicates that action was involved and not simply observation. Noah also took the extreme step of cursing his grandson, which indicates the serious nature of what happened. So Canaan was presumably the guilty party. Canaan's connection with the Nephilim is explored in another video series entitled, "How Did the Nephilim Reappear After the Flood?" So here, we will simply note that the people that were descended from Canaan and who settled in that land that was eponymously named for him seem to inherit his penchant for sexual and spiritual depravity. Now, there are extra biblical writings from the Second Temple period, which is around 516 BC to 70 AD, that retell the stories of Genesis in more detail. And the four which are especially relevant to this discussion are the books of Enoch, Jasher, Jubilees, and Giants, and especially the first portion of Enoch, which is known as the Book of Watchers. Only fragments of the Book of Giants have been found along with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but others are available full, and you can find them on the internet. Now, the canonicity of the Second Temple writings has been debated, and ultimately it was rejected. So they do not have the same cachet of reliability as the Bible does. However, the Book of Enoch is included in the Bible used by the churches in Ethiopia. But these works did have a large influence on Jewish thought in the period of the early church, and especially on the biblical books of Peter and Jude. Jude has direct quotes from the Book of Watchers. Like other ancient documents, they may not be completely reliable, but they still may have significant elements of fact and truth. Now, the Book of Enoch is thought to have been written in the 3rd century BC, and there is much scholarly debate about the sources used for this writing. Some have suggested that the authors had access to ancient works that have not been preserved. However, there are ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts that have been found in cuneiform that date to around 2500 BC, and they're known as the Utuku Lamutu, and they refer to methods for dealing with demons, with spiritual beings who were evil, unclean spirits. And this source contained incantations and cleansing rituals found throughout Mesopotamia. They describe the behavior of demons as being totally evil, violent, and unappeasable, and they may very well have supplied some of the background for the above writings of Enoch and the others. The incantation cast by the enchanter was meant to heal the patient by sending the demon to the netherworld, similar to the destination described in 2 Peter and Jude references that we quoted in the previous episode. Now, this is essentially what we would today refer to as an exorcism, but without the power of God. This can be extremely dangerous, and in some cases it can be lethal for both exorcist and exorcee. See, for example, Malachi Martin's book, Hostage to the Devil. And here are sections from several of the above-mentioned writings regarding the sons of God and the Nephilim. When the sons of God had multiplied, in those days beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget children for ourselves. And they, the human wives, conceived from them and bore them great giants. And the giants begot Nephilim, and they were growing in accordance with their greatness. They were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and men were not able to supply them. And the giants began to kill men and devour them. And every man made unto himself a god. And they robbed and plundered every man his neighbor, as well as his relative. And they corrupted the earth, and the earth was filled with violence. And their judges and rulers took their wives by force from their husbands according to their choice. These fallen angels knew the secrets of all things. And at this time sin was great on the earth. The wicked angels killed many people and begot giants with mortal women. The wicked angels consumed everything that the earth produced. The great fish, the birds in the sky, all the fruit of the earth, all kinds of grain, the fruit of the trees, and all the creeping things of the earth. They performed every harsh deed with harsh utterance upon male and female creation, and upon and among humanity itself. The fallen ones defiled all creation, and begot giants and monstrous creatures, and corrupted all the earth, which was defiled by bloodshedding at the hands of the giants. But this did not suffice them, and they were seeking all the time to devour and destroy more. The monsters attacked all creation. Now, according to these writings, the sons of God came to earth in the territory of northern Israel that we talked about, known as Bashan. And the term Bashan has also been known as Bathan, which is the Ugaritic word for serpent. And in the days of ancient Canaan, Bashan was therefore the place of the serpent, the place of Satan. Now, the specific location of Bathan, where the sons of God came to earth, was said to be Mount Hermon. That's a mountain on the border between Israel and Lebanon, and it's actually a range of mountains as shown on the map. The name Hermon comes from Haram, meaning to designate or consign to the afterlife. In other words, to separate something from its natural state and consign it either to destruction, if the object was evil, or to a devoted sacred service, if the object was good. There is an ancient, probably Roman-era temple near the summit of Mount Hermon, which is known as Qasr Antar. Now it is in ruins, but it was previously contained a slab with an inscription stating, "Those who take an oath proceed from here." Now this may have been based on a passage from the Book of Watchers, which tells of their arrival. And Shemihazah, their chief, said to them, "I fear that you will not want me to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin." And they all answered him and said, "Let us all swear an oath, and let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed." Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse. And they were, all of them, 200, who descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. The gates of hell, to which Jesus referred to in the New Testament, and that's in Matthew chapter 6, is a physical cave located near the town of Caesarea Philippi, which is in turn right at the base of Mount Hermon. This area is also known as Panias, the place of the god Pan. And there, in former times, was a large sanctuary dedicated to Pan there. And out of that area there flows streams of water from the snowmelt of the mountain. Niches were long ago carved into the rock face over the cave entrance to hold statues of pagan deities, and especially Pan. He was the satyr, or the goat man. Pan was a nature god known for wildness, sexual debauchery, violence, and great strength. And the gates of hell cave was described by the Jewish historian Josephus as follows. A dark cave opens on itself, within which there is a horrible precipice that descends abruptly to a vast depth. It contains a mighty quantity of water, which is immovable, and when anybody lets down anything to measure the depth of the water, no length of cord is sufficient to reach it. Now the statues were removed, and the niches were defaced in Byzantine times. But this area had previously been a large center for pagan fertility worship, with a number of shrines on Mount Hermon and in the vicinity, not simply the sanctuary of Pan. It was believed that the water flowing from this cave was from the gods of the underworld, providing life or withholding it if the water failed to flow. The watchers may have brought their women here to mate with them, and if so, that orgiastic mating process, coupled with the water flow, may be why this area became one of the main centers of pagan fertility worship. Now, one of the sons of God was named Azazel, and he is mentioned in Leviticus 16 as the scapegoat sent into the wilderness to get rid of sin. He was a goat demon who may have prefigured and been the inspiration for Pan. Mount Hermon may also very well have been the location of Jesus' transfiguration, which took place after his visit to Caesarea Philippi, and in which victory over Satan was declared. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. That's from Matthew chapter 17. This area is kind of a ground zero for the gods against whom Jesus was fighting his cosmic spiritual war. Mount Hermon was a location where the Watchers came to Earth and led their rebellion and miscegenation which birthed the Nephilim. Bashan, the place of the serpent, was their headquarters. Now, this location was previously associated with demons. So at the Transfiguration was therefore when Christ could have reclaimed the territory for Jehovah. And this fits well with the meaning of Hermon as being redevoted to a sacred purpose. It may also be part of the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and both of those were part of the area where Bashan was located, with contempt. But later on he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. And that's from Isaiah chapter 9. Now likewise, the land of Canaan, from ancient times down to the present, is a battleground. It was named for and first inhabited by the descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, who was cursed by Noah, and as mentioned above, the Canaanites were the most sexually debauched of all the ancient peoples. And this land was the place where the descendants of the pre-flood Nephilim were also reputed to live. And it was also the land to which God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. So it's not surprising that this small region, which is the same size as the American state of New Jersey, should have such a long history of conflict and hatred. Knowing that this was to be the future land of Israel, it seems that Satan seeded it with spiritual booby traps and landmines. Now, ancient history is filled with both written and artistic depictions of man-beast combinations, such as Pan and the centaurs. And the latter were part man and part donkey or horse. Like Pan, they were often depicted with large phalluses, and they were orgiastic and sexually insatiable, mating with and raping both human females and animals. Now, it's generally assumed that they were legendary, and perhaps at one point in history they were actually real. It's often acknowledged that many myths have some basis in historical reality, and in that vein it's interesting that Pan was one of the chief deities worshipped and celebrated at the gates of hell, mentioned above. Now, in current society, we often use animals as team symbols and mascots. For example, the basketball and football teams from Chicago are the Bulls and the Bears. And by the way, one of my favorites is the Horned Frogs from Texas Christian University. However, The ancient use of animals goes much deeper than using them merely as symbols of strength or wisdom or teams. Certain animals were thought to embody various divine characteristics or beings, and many of the ancient gods were, of course, represented as fully human or as an element of nature, but many others incorporated both animal and human features into the same entity in both artistic and documentary references. And there are hundreds of such references from almost all ancient societies. Here are a few of the Egyptian gods and the animals that were associated with them. Anubis, a jackal. Apis, a bull. Horus, a falcon or hawk. Hathor, a cow. Khepri, a scarab or dung beetle. Renanet, a cobra. Sobek, a crocodile. Tuaret, a hippopotamus. Now, people who acted as the god or on behalf of the god would wear or be depicted with the head of the associated animal. For example, Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, is typically shown with the head of a falcon or a hawk, and the eye of Horus was a symbol of his power and wisdom. And the pharaohs of Egypt were supposedly all descended from Horus. Now, the books of Jasher and Enoch both indicate that the Watchers engaged in genetic engineering in order to produce various combinations of animals and humans, as well as originating the Nephilim. In those days, men took from the cattle of the earth and the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, and taught the mixture of animals of one species with the other, in order therewith to provoke the Lord. And the Egyptian historian Manetho was commissioned by the Greeks to write a history of Egypt, and he also spoke of this. And they, the gods, were said to have brought forth double-winged human beings, and others with 4 wings and 2 faces, and with 1 body and 2 heads, male and female within one creature. Still other human beings had thighs of goats and horns upon their heads. Others were horses behind and men in front. There were also said to have been man-headed bulls and 4-bodied dogs, whose tails emerged like fish tails from their backs, and other monsters, such as all kinds of dragon-like beings, whose images they arranged from one beside the other in the temple of Belos and preserved. Now, this mixing of species and genders, if it was indeed performed by the sons of God, was a corruption of nature and evil in the eyes of God. For example, you shall not breed together 2 kinds of your cattle. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed, nor wear a garment upon you with 2 kinds of material mixed together. And we'll discuss later why God may have prohibited that. Now, we don't know how the sons of God would have accomplished this miscegenation, but as spirit beings, they presumably had much more information, intelligence, and insight into biology and other scientific matters than we have even today. And it's significant that their purpose was not to help or save humanity, but rather to corrupt us. But this is also not to suggest that all of the human-animal combinations, such as the ones shown above, were historically real. It may well have been that only a few of those were created, and the rest were a later product of imagination and projection. Furthermore, all of them would presumably have been destroyed by the flood, and would not have reappeared afterwards. However, their presence would be remembered and communicated to future generations, who then depicted their gods as animals and the forces of nature, such as in the list above. For example, the Bible describes the journey of Israelites through the wilderness of Sin to Mount Sinai, where the 10 Commandments were given to Moses. And by the way, the area was called Sin, not because it was sinful, but rather because Sin was the name of the god of that region, and he was also the god of the crescent moon. Mount Sinai is the mountain of the god Sin, hence its name. It is in the territory of Midian, which is now the western side of Saudi Arabia, and the Kaaba stone, which is at the center of the Muslim Hajj in Mecca, was originally a place of moon god worship. Now Moses was on the mountain for over a month, and the people grew tired of waiting for him. And in response to their complaints, Aaron, the chief priest, created a golden calf for the people to worship. Now, this may seem strange, but the symbol of the moon god Sin was a bull with upraised horns, enclosing a round disc representing the moon, as shown here. The Canaanite god Baal, as well as many of the other gods from Egypt and Mesopotamia, were often depicted in the same way. In Egypt, this god was known as Apis, the bull god, or Hathor, the cow god. So rather than wait for Moses and remain true to Yahweh, the Israelites took on the color of their surroundings and engaged in worship rituals like the Egyptians and the people around them did. The bull was an ancient symbol of strength, fertility, and sexuality. And after eating and drinking, the Israelites rose up to play, as described in Exodus chapter 32. Now, idols such as the golden calf forged by Aaron were not inherently magical or mystical. Rather, they were condemned by God because of their association with one or more demons, which the idol actually represented. Idols were avatars for demons, and by worshiping the idol, the people were thus identifying with, behaving like, and giving themselves to the demons that were behind the idol, rather than worshiping the true God and becoming more like him. As described in the book of Enoch, the sons of God were also apparently instrumental in corrupting people in yet another way, by false religious teaching, astrology, divination, magic, and sorcery. And all of these are satanic, in that they're focused on attempts to engage spiritual powers for selfish purposes, to gain more influence and fulfill personal desires in ways that were banned by God. Shemihaza taught spells and the cutting of roots. Hermon taught sorcery for the loosing of spells, and magic and skill. Barakel taught the signs of lightning flashes. Kokabel taught the signs of the stars. Zikel taught the signs of the shooting stars. Artaquoth taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the signs of the moon. These are all from 1st Enoch. Now, the list of sciences taught by the fallen watchers is also the list of the professional specializations of the Yosipu, and they were the Babylonian enchanters and magicians. And earlier, we referred to the cleansing rituals from the Utuku Lamutu that these guys actually engaged in. These spiritistic activities were taught by the sons of God, and they were condemned in the Bible because they involved contact with demons, who are inherently deceptive and evil, and lead to the individual either being influenced by or possibly possessed by demons. Now, we don't know how long the sons of God were on the earth, or any of the details on the progress of the fall of humanity into corruption, and exactly how long that took, and what happened. But there is a suggestion of the relative time frame. The book of Enoch indicates that the arrival of the sons of God took place at some point during the days of Jared. He was the father of Enoch, who was the 6th generation from Adam. And if we assume that this happened at Enoch's birth, the flood occurred 1,034 years later. So there was plenty of time for the Nephilim to multiply and for their impact to be felt. Now, Enoch's son Methuselah, and by the way, Methuselah's name means, when he is dead, it shall be sent. Methuselah was born when Enoch was 65 years old. And Methuselah lived for 969 years and died just before the flood occurred. The sons of God were eventually imprisoned in Tartarus to await the day of judgment, as discussed in the previous episode, but we don't know when that exactly took place. Presumably, it was at the time of the flood. Now, it usually takes time and events to turn marginally bad people into monsters. But given the way that the Nephilim were described, perhaps they, as a race, naturally had the characteristics that we today would describe as psychopathic, such as serial killers who select their victims at random. The associated traits of psychopathy include the following: superficial charm combined with the use of mind games, the absence of nervousness and little concern for personal safety, substance abuse, extreme selfishness, no respect for law or custom, continual deception, deviousness and cunning, unrelenting condescension and threatening behavior, overly controlling and sexually obsessive. Guiltlessness, the lack of conscience and refusal to take responsibility. Rapid mood shifts, especially when the individual is unable to win and or to get their way, and swings between depression and animation. A twisted view of reality and a total lack of empathy. Now, psychopathy may be mild, but in the more extreme forms, there seems to be a complete self-deception. In other words, you're not truly a psychopath if you're able to realize that you are a psychopath. A psychologist with experience dealing with such individuals had this to say. Some have suggested that psychopaths might be rightly considered a different species because they're so different with respect to the critical attributes that most of us think define us as being human. But there's no solid scientific foundation for that notion. Nevertheless, during my many years dealing with psychopaths, I was most struck by the fact that many consider themselves not only to be very different from the rest of us, but also clearly superior to us, because they did not carry with them the vulnerability that typically accompanies having feelings and a conscience. And it's their psychological sense of superiority, a truly malignant narcissism, that gives rise to their sense of entitlement to prey on those that they regard as inferior creatures. Now, we don't understand what causes these conditions and why they're more severe in certain people, but they seem to involve both genetics, physiology, and behavior. Now, psychopathology has been intensively studied in recent decades due to the incidence of serial killers and the need for law enforcement to understand and stop them. But investigation into any genetic basis of psychopathy is relatively new. Little research has examined genetic and environmental contributions to psychopathic personality traits. Additionally, no studies have examined etiological connections between psychopathic traits and the broad psychopathological domains of internalizing, in other words, mood and anxiety, and externalizing, antisocial behavior and substance abuse. The current study was designed to fill these gaps in the literature. These results indicate that different psychopathic traits show distinct genetically based relations within the broad dimensions of psychopathology. In other words, there seems to be a genetic precursor in psychopathic individuals, which causes differences in their brain structure and functioning, which is then triggered by evil thoughts and actions. Studies of brain activity in psychopathic individuals show a lack of response to emotional scenes that would evoke a significant response in normal individuals. A study from King's College in 2012 found that violent male offenders who met the diagnosis for psychopathy displayed significantly reduced gray matter volumes in certain brain regions. This striking abnormality in the part of the brain associated with empathy and feelings of guilt point to a clear neurological difference between regular violent offenders and genuine psychopaths. A 2013 study took MRI scans for 121 prison inmates that were rated as psychopathic. The inmates were shown images displaying physical pain and then asked to imagine that accident, that pain, happening to themselves or to others. The subjects displayed a pronounced empathetic reaction and response to the thought of pain when imagined to themselves. However, when asked to imagine the same pain inflicted upon others, those psychopathic subjects displayed a very different response. Not only did those empathetic areas of the brain fail to activate, but increased activity was seen in another brain region that handles reward processing, motivation, and decision making. So the study suggested that psychopaths could actually enjoy imagining pain being inflicted upon others. However, psychopathic tendencies clearly don't always lead to criminal or antisocial behavior. Rather, it seems that a more complicated set of neurological conditions create negative actions. A lack of empathy, overacting reward centers, and an inability to evaluate future consequences all line up and lead one to make a decision that normal people would classify as psychopathic. The legal and social implications of this research are unsettling for many. If we can classify criminal or abhorrent behavior as merely neurological dysfunction, then our entire basis for asserting legal responsibility may tend to fall apart. Intent is currently a vital aspect in asserting judgment across our legal system. If someone can defer a degree of conscious responsibility regarding their actions to simply the way their brain is wired, then where does that leave us? Now, all of this may be why Moses and Joshua in the Old Testament instructed the Israelites to completely wipe out certain groups that were genetically Nephilim. It was therefore an act of mercy for humanity rather than an act of cruelty. However, Jehovah's focus, the focus of God, was not on destroying Canaanite peoples, but rather on destroying their idols, their places of worship, and the places where their sacred prostitution was performed. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. And you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. And that text was from Deuteronomy chapter 12. Again, the reason for this is that Jehovah wanted his people to become like him, rather than like the gods of the society around them. He wanted them to be noble, loving, and morally pure. And unfortunately, the people of Israel didn't often obey God and abandoned what God had told them. Now, behind the idols were demons, and their central characteristic is an overweening desire to have one's own way. As in the words of the Satanist Aleister Crowley, do what thou wilt. The god Pan, and by the way, that's from where we get the word panic, would seem to be a good example of this characteristic, as well as being psychopathological. Pan was said to be superficially charming, wild, violent, cunning, devious, drunken, orgiastic, sexually insatiable, and focused entirely on his own desires. And long ago, people began to picture Satan as a goat, possibly because of his association with Pan. In any case, almost all of these psychopathic characteristics indicated above are associated with Satan, who is the ultimate psychopath. Having rejected God and everything he stands for, Satan and the demons have become everything that God is not, and therefore they are the epitome of evil. Now, unlike the gentleman devils of literature, such as Mephistopheles and Faust, the real devil and his compadres are totally corrupt, deceptive, malicious, violent, perverted, foul, and evil to the core. On the one hand, the demons know that God will ultimately judge and destroy them. But on the other hand, they seem to have the total self-deception and the denial of the psychopath. And human psychopaths will sometimes even taunt police with obscure clues to show how supposedly intelligent they are. And like psychopaths, demons are very cunning and may use superficial charm in pretending to be angels of light. But their purpose is ultimately to enslave and destroy people. Why? As was previously stated, it is because angels are God's messengers sent to serve people. And from the perspective of a spirit being, people are a lower order. So rather than debase themselves in serving us sinful humans, the demons wanted to rule over us. And Satan, as the ultimate demon, wanted ultimate power from himself. And the way he is able to exercise that power is to corrupt people with the same desires that led to his fall. So here's a text from Isaiah that explains what happened to him. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. And by the way, Satan's original name here was Lucifer, meaning light. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mountain of assembly, on the ultimate heights of Mount Zaphon. In other words, on the heights of the north. I will ascend to the top of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. But you were brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you stare at you, and they ponder your fate. Is this the one who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble? The one who made the world a wilderness, and who overthrew its cities and would not let its captives go home? All the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out of your tomb, like a rejected branch. You are covered with the slain, with those pierced by the sword, those who descend to the stones of the pit. Like a corpse trampled underfoot, you will not join them in burial, for you have destroyed your land and have killed your people. And that's from Isaiah chapter 14. Now, when the sons of God mated with human women, they therefore may have given their Nephilim progeny a large genetic dose and a predisposition to an extreme form of psychopathology. If that was indeed the case, the sons of God would not only be able to create a proxy army, but also to genetically pollute the human race, as the Nephilim and their children in turn mated with others. Imagine, for example, a society of psychopaths who were also large, strong, vicious, and cunning, and sexually ravenous at a time when there were few weapons that normal individuals could use to fend them off. They would, of course, be bad to each other, but also direct their energy against others, creating continual conflict, rape, violence, suffering, and death. The Bible describes the Nephilim as follows: clouds without water are carried along by winds, autumn trees without fruit, doubly dead and uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up their own shame like foam, wandering stars, for whom the dark blackness, the black darkness has been reserved forever. And that's from the book of Jude. This seems to be the state of the world in Genesis chapter 6, in the days of Noah. And given these conditions, it becomes easier to understand God's mindset in his response. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Then God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth." Genesis 6. Now, the worship of Pan and other historical gods has been revived by New Age spiritualists, who view them as paradigms for liberation and sexual freedom. Furthermore, the New Age gods of today have been tamed from what they were like in ancient times, in order not to overly offend modern sensibilities. If people are, however, confronted with the real Pan, and if they realized the actual reality of Satan and his true nature, and if they understood what actually took place in the days before the flood, they would appreciate what God did rather than accuse him of cruelty and injustice. A subsequent question to be explored: if psychopathology is heritable, and if it began with the Nephilim, is it possible that this was the origin of all human psychopathic tendencies? Also, how exactly did genetics influence psychopathology? And these would be interesting research topics. Another issue is the current research and development of transhumanism, which is the genetic alteration of people. It is an attempt to eliminate disease and provide superhuman capabilities of size, strength, perception, night vision, and others. And ironically, after years of eating food based on genetically altered grains that were supposedly better and healthier, we now understand that GMO foods may actually be bad for us. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine, AAEM, urges doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets for all patients. They cite animal studies showing organ damage, gastrointestinal and immune system disorders, accelerated aging, and infertility. Human studies show how genetically modified food can leave material behind inside of us, possibly causing long-term problems. Genes inserted into soy, for example, can transfer into the DNA of bacteria living inside us. And the toxic insecticide that produced GMO corn was found in the blood of pregnant women and their unborn fetuses. Numerous health problems increased after GMOs were introduced in 1996. The percentage of Americans with 3 or more chronic illnesses jumped from 7% to 13% in just 9 years. Food allergies skyrocketed, and disorders such as autism, reproductive disorders, digestive problems, and others are on the rise. Although there is not sufficient research to confirm that GMOs are a contributing factor, doctor groups such as the AAEM tell us not to wait before we start protecting ourselves, and especially our children, who are most at risk. Now, transhumanism is the much more serious step of going beyond GMOs and directly modifying people. And in the name of curing diseases, some scientists have forged ahead into a brave new world with no idea of the long-term consequences of genetic tampering of the human race. Especially sobering is the thought of genetically altered people reproducing and having children. At that point, this is going to be very hard to ever turn back. What will be the impact on society if GMIs, in other words, genetically modified individuals, develop new incurable diseases, spawn new pandemics worse than the coronavirus, and/or have mental or physical issues that cause them to be violent and abusive on a mass scale? Another possible demonic issue is that of alien abductions and the purported attempts by aliens to use human women to create a population of unknown characteristics. And given the failure of the previously mentioned exoplanet and SETI initiatives to find evidence for extraterrestrial populations, perhaps aliens and UFOs are actually manifestations of demons attempting to recreate a contemporary race of transhuman hybrids. In effect, a contemporary version of the Nephilim. Consider these quotes. Demonology is not just another crackpotology. It is the ancient and scholarly study of monsters and demons who have seemingly coexisted with man throughout history. The manifestations and occurrences described in this imposing literature are similar, if not entirely identical, to the UFO phenomenon itself. Victims of demonic possession suffer the very same medical and emotional symptoms as UFO contactees have had. The devil and his demons can, according to the literature, manifest themselves in almost any form, and can physically imitate anything from angels to horrifying monsters with glowing eyes. Strange objects and entities materialize and dematerialize in these stories, just as the UFOs and their splendid occupants appear and disappear, walk through walls, and perform other supernatural feats. Is this the origin of many tales and legends where genetics play a great role? The fairy tales involving human midwives and changelings, and the sexual overtones of the flying saucer reports, and the biblical stories between the Lord's angels and terrestrial women whose offspring were giants? Now, all of this raises the specter of hybrid armies and other end-time scenarios from the book of Revelation. Is this what our world is coming to? May the Lord Jesus help us, and with his help, we will live. If you like this channel, please click on the like and share buttons. If you want to see more videos from this channel, please click on the subscribe and notify buttons. Thanks for watching.